With this, please help me welcome Thania. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be using this mic. Is it working?
Live. Just put them at back.
Can you hear me?
We need for the recording the mic to work, so let's switch that going. Can you get number 4 going?
Good afternoon. Okay, there we go. Okay, this is an obstacle course. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I had a little article forwarded to me last week, and the article was about how Pepsi was no longer going to be delivering insights using PowerPoint decks in their organization. Did anybody see that? Raise your hands. Okay. That's a pretty drastic step, but it's one that illustrates something that has been a challenge for us as an industry for quite some time. And we had a study that was published in 2009 by the Boston Consulting Group that basically said something similar. The challenge that Pepsi's having is they're not able to influence people with PowerPoint decks or inspire action with their good insights anymore. And when you look at the Boston Consulting Group findings and you look at one of the questions regarding the value that consumer insights teams brought to the organization, it was phrased in a statement that said, how much do you agree with our consumer insights or market research personnel translates research findings into clear business recommendations for senior executives? And they asked these questions of researchers in different companies, and sadly only 58% of them in a top 2-box agreement scale gave that response, yes, we agree, and 32% of the stakeholders in those same organizations said the same thing. I think the 58% is disconcerting to say that about your own function, but I think more importantly, the gap here is what we want to focus on, that 26-point gap between what the researchers in an organization think and the stakeholders think. So there's a disconnect with the value that we are able to bring to an organization in terms of solutions that come through insights. And why that's important is because we need people to be inspired by our research, to be able to act on it. It doesn't really matter, if you look at this cartoon, it doesn't really matter how good your insights are, how good your research is, if you're going to fall down in that last critical step of being able to deliver insights. Now, just a show of hands, how many of you have sat in a presentation room on the receiving end of this cartoon in the last month? Okay, I see 2 hands from Peter, thank you. Now, let's see if any of you admit to being the provider of death in that situation in the last month. Not so many. I know I've been on both sides. Honestly, at some point or another, we find ourselves in this meeting room with something really important to say, and we stumble out of the gate because we have too much information, we don't have the right information. So finding the best way to deliver the message is really what this talk is all about. And people talk about storytelling quite a bit and in this context, and it's because we hear this we see it everywhere, the books being written on the power of story. And this is not anything new except, as it applies to our discipline, we haven't really been versed in telling stories. And the principle is very simple. If you tell a good story, it's going to stick, it's going to perhaps inspire somebody to do something different with our data, and we might be able to influence strategy and that way be able to improve our business. Simple, right? But it's not that simple, and it's the reason why I'm here today to share with you 4 skills that we need to be actively training, and there are many others that we spend some time on, particularly through the courses that we give at the Burke Institute, where we train people, and there is a dire need for training in this area of communication of insight and doing that very important critical last step. So I'm going to share with you 4 things that researchers, either those of us who've been in the industry for a while, we can hone these skills, or new entrants into our industry that they need to be working on pretty diligently. The first one is to learn to tailor your communication to your audience. Now that sounds pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but we tend to suffer from this thing called the curse of knowledge, where as a deliverer of the message, sometimes we have a really difficult time getting ourselves out of our own skins and using or looking at things through the lens of the people who are receiving our information. And it's like an out-of-body experience almost. You have to be able to look at things from a completely different angle than your own. And if you put yourself in your audience's shoes, you will be asking yourself questions like, well, how do they internalize information? What level of research terminology can they actually handle? And that's an important one because we tend to sometimes get bogged down with terms, and our audiences may or may not be amenable or be able to understand exactly what we mean. So what matters most to them? Focus on that, of course, and how much data do we really need to show them? Once we've used the data to come to a point of meaning, do we really need to share everything? This is a really basic framework from Dr. Andrew Abella, who wrote a really great book called Advanced Presentation Design. And it's another thing that's important to keep in mind when it comes to audiences. We are in the business of gathering insights that drive action, hopefully. So keeping action in mind. What do we want your audience to think, or what are they thinking now? And what do you want them to think after your presentation? Or what are they doing or not doing today that they should start doing after your presentation? So keeping things not just about your audience, but in terms of what you want your audience, or what kind of change you want to impact, are very important things to keep in mind. And doing something like this on your next project is not hard. It takes a little bit of thinking, but hopefully it can help guide the way that you present your results. Another skill is synthesis. And if you read the GRIT report that was published in the last few days, there was a big emphasis on synthesis as a skill that is part of the emerging skill set of research. And it's very important in this day where there's so much information to focus on what is meaningful. Frank and Magnan wrote a book titled Drinking from the Fire Hose, and this quote came directly from them. Most presentations present far too much data. That is, they spend too much of the listener's time on the what, and not nearly enough time on the so what and the now what. And I have to agree. Sometimes we fail to do the basics, and that is starting with the business questions, focusing on the key points that you want your audience to take away. And my favorite part of this is being selective and using the appendix more wisely. We have a problem with this. We tend to get marred down with all of the information that we collect. And trust me, I'm a researcher. I love my data, and I have a very hard time parting with it. But when it comes to being able to tell a story and focus on things that are meaningful, we have to learn to edit, kind of like a movie director would take all the shots that they take on set and on site. And all of these things get clipped down, and there's a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. And the only things that are left are the things that contribute to the story. So we can certainly learn to do that. And you have to get better at synthesizing, finding meaning, and then sticking to only those things that matter. And remember that getting to the now what is the whole point. So let's try to keep those stories short and sweet. Number 3, learn how to make things memorable. This is, again, part of storytelling is the idea that things stick in your head a little bit better than they would otherwise. So making things sticky or memorable is a very important part of inspiring action. And you see this called out specifically by Stan and Chip Heath, who wrote that book, Made to Stick. And some of the principles that they outlined, I think, apply to what we do in terms of what makes a memorable message. The first thing is simplicity. We just talked about focusing on things that are meaningful. Concrete. Say it in layman's terms. Leave the academic sounding jargon for research where it belongs, not on your story, not to your audience. So keeping it in terms that people can understand. And one of the things that really helps me sometimes with this is to try and pretend you're having a conversation with somebody who doesn't know research. Maybe pretend you're talking to a friend, pretend you're talking to your mom about what you're working on, and you will find yourself using much more concrete language than you would have otherwise. Make it credible. And when somebody questions your data, the answer that we tend to give is one more data point. And if they question that one, then you give them more data. And you can play that game all day long. But what's going to be more impactful to make it stick and to make it salient is to give examples, credible examples, things that are going to make the point more a little clearer for the person who's asking the question. And last, well, almost last, but on this page last, emotions. Images in particular, 50% of our attention is visual, so anything that you can do to illustrate your points or tell your story through images is going to be more powerful. And you see people do that sometimes very well in some of the presentations that you see coming out of our industry today, but there's an opportunity to do even more because images are powerful in the emotions that they evoke. So finding a way to narrate, this is the last element of a memorable message, is this idea of storytelling. You know, tell a story, narrate. It's how we communicate and it's how we share. So it's probably going to be more memorable. And we are indeed in what we call a problem resolution narrative. You know, in research, we have a problem that we're going to try and figure out the solution through questions and, you know, get to an insight in terms of what the cause is to provide recommendations and a solution for our clients. So the error that we make sometimes is in presenting a whole bunch of facts, and really good facts at that. We're excellent at reporting facts. What we need to get better at is connecting those data points. Those vaguely connected ideas can come together into a narrative a little bit more easily. And you can do this a variety of different ways. If you're very creative, you can do a storyboard like the one that's illustrated here. That's a 30-second spot example. It even has chirping sound effects in the bottom. You don't have to go that far. But the idea is that you can follow a story in these 6 squares from beginning, middle, and end. And you can try to do the same in a couple other ways. If you're not that artistic, you can do it and, you know, write it in prose, a couple of paragraphs, a famous elevator speech. You know, what is this about? What's the beginning, the middle, of the end of my story? Read it back to yourself and see if it makes sense. Or you can use an outline, which is what I like to do. Bullet it out, move things around. As long as there is a sequence, as long as there is a beginning, a middle, an end, and some form of connection, you're on a good path for storytelling. The last thing that we need to build skill sets around, and this is a tough one, is making it consumable. And, you know, a lot of that has to do with aesthetics. You did your homework on the audience, you have the things that matter, but making it consumable can be the last thing that can help you. Sometimes it might require, you know, we've all seen nice PowerPoints. To take it to the next level, you might need some graphic support. And so we need to learn to maybe not hire researchers who are graphic designers, but to have those resources available for people to be able to leverage, and learning how to ask for deliverables that look more like this, as opposed to the traditional, you know, dry PowerPoint slides that we love to produce. And infographics are another way that we've, in a big way, seen an impact of these things coming out with ways of giving us another way to present information in a form of a reference, in a story-like fashion. Each of these represents a story that are very consumable. And going beyond the slide, which is what Pepsi has ended up doing quite a bit of. They've been using apps, they've been using quizzes. Sometimes we've delivered insights in the form of magazines that look like a publication that you see here, or a newsletter. Other times it's video, and it really depends on the engagement, and it depends on your ability to get something like this done, but you could also even stage a live show, which we've done for a client where it's a deployment of insights, and it's like a live talk show discussion where we had some actors and some people from the client team join us to be able to bring the insights to life better for their audiences. So, in summary, communication skills that we need to really work on. 1, learn to identify what will resonate with different stakeholder audiences. Practice synthesis, editing. And editing, really, you have to go and practice. And when you think you've edited the most you can, you need to figure out how you're going to edit some more, because there's always an opportunity to make it simpler. And be persuasive in the way that you tell stories. Understand how to leverage new tools, use graphic support, and really think outside the box. Use your creativity. If we lived in a post-apocalyptic world where PowerPoint no longer existed, what would we do? And that's the question of the day that hopefully spurs some thoughts in terms of how to bring your insights to life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are sharing the mic for this session. And any questions? Eric, can we get one mic over there?
I'm just curious what others have experienced because I'm with Capital One, and so we use a lot of outside suppliers to help us in quant and qual research. And one thing I'm yearning for is to have suppliers actually write stories, not just deliver data points to me. Right now it lands on us to write the story. Do you find that to be the case, and are more sort of suppliers looking into writing stories with data, or do they feel like that really is the responsibility of the client?
Well, I can tell you what we do at Burke to start with, and others can weigh in. But we've put a great deal of emphasis on the way that we get to the story in collaboration with our clients, because it is indeed a collaboration. It's something that requires a different dialogue. Oftentimes we get to the end of a project and the report happens almost by osmosis, and it happens. So what we're trying to do is be more intentional with the way that we are having conversations early in the process, and before we're jumping way too far into creation of information, we're having the right dialogue with the client to say, here's what we're seeing, what do you see? Because one thing we will not be able to fill in completely is that role of having the business view into your organization. And remembering just the fact that we are delivering for you, but that you are delivering for an entire group of people, and understanding what those people's needs are is critically important to successfully crafting something that is closer to what you think of when you think of a story. And you might still have some work to do, and you might have additional deliverables, but it's a very different output when you have that kind of discussion.
I don't get anything close to that.
I can add a comment. We have information design engineer who works for our company, and all kind of data goes in. Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying we have an internal resource who is a design engineer, and they focus on ugly data to make it beautiful. And they use a couple things. One is they do it themselves, or you could go to, with a good brief, you can go to places like 99 Designs and stuff like that, and get the architecture for those infographics where you can pump data into them. And it's as cheap as $99 or as expensive as $7.99.
Now, it's important to make a distinction, though, between data visualization and storytelling. I think they are very separate things, and they go hand in hand. The aspects that you were mentioning, David, for data visualization, you do need to look for those shortcuts sometimes, because not everybody has access to graphic designers, and it can get tedious. But the core of what you're going to design, the story itself, I think that's where we have an opportunity to do a better job, and the data visualization will follow.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And help me, Thania. Thank you.